There was a Time magazine cover story in May of 1994 that read, "There are no devils left in hell. They're all in Rwanda." Well, I had packed that edition of the magazine into my bag, strapped $50,000 around my waist, and immediately left my home in Nairobi, Kenya, to set up an emergency relief program in Rwanda. There in Kigali, the capital, a few nights later, I was reading that article by candlelight while sitting at a wobbly kitchen table in a recently ransacked and abandoned home. Gunfire echoed in the darkness as the city had recently been captured by the Rwandan Patriotic Army, and the stench of dead bodies filtered through the bullet holes that riddled the windows in my newfound home. In just 100 days, approximately 800,000 people, primarily Tutsis, were slaughtered in Rwanda, and the rivers literally overflowed with dead bodies. First came the corpse of men and older boys. Then came the women and girls who'd been flushed out of their hiding places and cut down with machetes. And last were the babies. Longtime neighbors slaughtered neighbors. Children were separated by ethnic group and hacked to death. And priests locked frightened parishioners in churches and participated in the burning and killing. I had just come from 2 years of working in the chaos of Somalia that was cloaked in the death and desperation of a famine that killed hundreds of thousands of people. And I thought that that had steeled me for the worst that this world could create in terms of heartbreak and human suffering. But what I witnessed in Rwanda was a brutality and evil on a terrifying scale. And nothing could have prepared me for the immensity of the killing or the level of hatred that I encountered in those who carried out the genocide. Well, that night, as I was reading the article, I was feeling pretty exhausted, as I had just traveled out to the countryside and discovered a church whose walls had recently been stained by the blood of Tutsis as they huddled together just before a fragmentation grenade exploded. And their belongings were scattered throughout the courtyard. School bags, combs, various shoes, all dropped in terror as they ran for the church that they thought would provide them with sanctuary, but it did not. And there comes a point in the telling of the story where the existing vocabulary for suffering is really just no longer adequate. So that night in Kigali, I also began to reflect on my life, and I began to worry that my work was beginning to impact a part of my character that had driven me to become a humanitarian worker in the first place, and that was my compassion. And it was a compassion that was cultivated as a young boy growing up in the quintessential small town of Corning, New York. Now, I was blessed. I was surrounded by a network of family and friends, great aunts and uncles, cousins, lifelong neighbors that encircled my life with a great sense of care and kindness. And oftentimes, their connection with the community was expressed through seemingly small acts of kindness. My great aunt Delora delivering the evening soup to her elderly neighbor Marguerite, or strangers returning my dog Brandy multiple times after finding him wandering on various dirt roads miles away. Well, the response to the flood of 1972, folks on the hill opening their homes to those evacuated from the flood zone, and the countless many toiling deep into the night of June 22nd to line the dike with sandbags, and the untold many that worked for days and weeks and months to clean and repair and to rebuild flooded homes. And it was the collective, seemingly small acts, neighbors helping neighbors through some of the toughest moments of their lives, that really made this community what it is today. So I'd like you to imagine this: a young, bright-eyed, very imaginative teenage boy stretched out on his parents' green shag carpeting in the mid-1970s, listening to a tape recording sent by his cousin who was in the Peace Corps and then Zaire. Well, she told tales of arduous journeys through the countryside, and battles to protect her health against the ravages of malaria, of corrupt local officials, and of her work with impoverished yet amazing villages deep inside the country. And at that moment, it just clicked. I knew I'd found my life's calling and that I would become a humanitarian worker. And part of me was enticed by the idea of traveling to foreign lands and being a part of something larger. And I had dreams of adventure and intriguing work. And while I would never profess to be walking in the footsteps of Mother Teresa, I was looking to actualize a deep sense of compassion that had been growing in me since I was a young boy. But that night back on the wobbly table, I was feeling very sad and disillusioned. And my senses were overcome by the sight of suffering. And at that moment, I felt helpless to make a difference. The enormity of challenges facing families in places like Rwanda and Somalia can be absolutely overwhelming at times. And the interconnectedness of issues, creating an endless and new set of issues, can make you throw your hands up in the air in utter frustration. So, focus on the big stuff became my solution for the next 10 years as a humanitarian worker, as the endless heartache had really turned me into a slightly jaded aid worker who'd been provided far too many glimpses into the brutal realities of the world. So managing 1,200 staff between two war-torn countries, moving in 100 tons of grain from this side of the country to that side of the country without it getting stolen, or responding to a cholera epidemic in a remote refugee camp on the side of a volcano, these things gave me the illusion of control. And frankly, they removed me from the gritty human element of my daily work. Well, that was until the day it happened, the day my heart cracked. It was a repressively humid day in Banda Aceh, Indonesia, right after the tsunami hit in December of 2004. Now imagine the force of a giant wave racing across 3,000 miles of the Indian Ocean, killing over 220,000 people in 10 countries, 60,000 alone in Banda Aceh. Well, when I think back on those early days after the tsunami hit, I remember it seemed to rain all the time. And survivors had but a piece of plastic to separate themselves from the elements. And dirt roads became impassable rivers of mud. And debris was piled as high and as far as the eye could see, as if the gods had dumped a gigantic box of Lincoln logs onto the earth below. And boats rested on roofs of remaining buildings. So I looked at all this through my jaded eyes as a logistics challenge. How could I get my supplies over here? How could I remove the rubble out of there? And how could I manage staff in a new and challenging environment? So as the staff and I were moving through the rubble and surveying this massive damage, the sight of a backhoe caught our eye as it was moving in the most unusual fashion. And so we stopped and we watched as it moved like the gentle hand of a father into this massive pile of debris. And with great care, it slowly removed the broken body of a young girl. And it was a young girl similar in age to my daughter, with the same long braid in her black hair and the same long, beautiful hands. And that cold, hard piece of steel brought that little body down at our feet. And that's when I heard it crack. And a large part of my heart broke that day. And even after all these years of humanitarian work, that very moment, I was completely and utterly overwhelmed. And my life was transformed forever. And we sat with the extended family later in mourning with no common language to share and no way to make things significantly better other than sharing a bit of kindness and compassion with one family overcome with grief. And after that day, it all changed, though. And though my heart cracked, it didn't break apart. And instead, those 10 years of numbness gave way to a renewed sense of purpose and commitment to not let these overwhelmingly heartbreaking situations remove me from the everyday human experience. Because I did discover that within that experience lies immense quantities of dignity and strength and courage, and yes, inspiration. And witnessing bad things endured by others can really harden the heart over time. And it can be in Asia, it can be in Africa, it can be here in the United States. Police officers, firefighters, healthcare workers, each has their heart tested and each has to work their way through it. For me, I discovered that only looking at the big picture meant that I missed the seemingly small things. Like holding a child's hand through the chaos of a new refugee camp, or sitting with a local leader who speaks with pride to the multitude of strengths within their community, or just being present with a family navigating the turbulent waters of grief. Well, I'm here today to say that those things can and do make a difference. And mobilizing our compassion, one small act at a time, might just provide us the fuel to tackle some of humanity's most daunting challenges. So in closing, I'd like to leave you with a challenge. And I'd like to ask all of you to take a moment right now to think about one person that you can share your compassion with in the next 24 hours. Now, maybe it's that neighbor who needs a helping hand, or perhaps a parent who would be boosted by the sound of your voice at the end of a phone call. And it might be as simple as flashing one of your warm smiles at a stranger walking down the street. But I ask you to please make a commitment to make that happen, knowing that your act of kindness, no matter how small, truly makes a difference. And from small things, big things grow. Thank you. Thank you.